Welcome to the first ever episode of Expat Life with Maimendel. I'm your host Marie, and every week we will explore the living abroad journeys with guests from all over the world. This week, our guest is Andrew Martin. Originally from Australia, we discuss his experience of moving to Japan after finding a teaching job from a newspaper, how Instagram prompted a move to Estonia, and how then moving to Switzerland drastically changed the way of life. Firstly, I would love to take the opportunity to thank you, Andrew, for taking the time to come and talk about your personal journeys and your life experiences and helping others to also learn from what you have experienced. So huge thank you for that.
No problem. I think it's an interesting topic for everyone.
Absolutely. And so I've prepared some questions that I want to ask you, obviously. But before I do that, I thought maybe it would be a good opportunity for you to just tell you a little bit more about yourself, where you're from, and kind of the pre-expat life story, I guess.
Well, I'm Andrew. I was born in Melbourne, Australia, where I resided until I was 22 years old, and then one day I said to my best friend, "Hey, let's move to Japan," and we moved to Japan. So lived there for a couple of years, and then came back home. Started my professional career, and I met my future wife. And prior to meeting me, she had lived overseas as well, and eventually we got married, and then we got to the stage in our lives where we thought, we want to live in another country again, and we haven't done that since we were married. So then we decided to start looking into countries to move to, and we ended up in Estonia and now in Switzerland.
It's an interesting journey, I think. And before we start talking about the Estonia part, which obviously I have a invested interest given I'm from here. I wanted to learn a little bit about your first kind of living abroad experience. You did it quite late compared to me. I started at 16, so I was in like my late teens.
Yeah, but you're European, so you've got a benefit.
That's fair. And why did you, so you mentioned that you just decided and said, let's move. And how did you choose Japan, and what kind of planning did you put in place?
Well, one of the reasons why I hadn't been overseas is because, as I say, it's Australia. It's hard to get to anywhere except New Zealand. So it got to the point where I'd finished my tertiary studies, and I was working almost full time, but not in the career job that I wanted to be working in. And so I was browsing through jobs one day, as you do, in a newspaper, because it was back in the days where that's when you browse for jobs. And I came across completely by fluke the Teach English in Japan jobs. And I read into it, and it seemed like a pretty good deal. It was a pretty comfortable way of living overseas, because the company actually, gets an apartment for you and gets you all the basic stuff that you need to start off with. So it's not like a massive ordeal. And I knew that my best mate was in a similar situation to me, and I told him about it, and he said, "Cool, let's do it." So,
amazing.
Yeah, first time going overseas. Oh, let's just go and live in another country. So why not?
So it was a teaching job you were doing in Japan then?
Yeah. Ask almost any foreigner in Japan, so what do you do here? 90% of them are saying teach English or teach my language.
That's amazing. And did you teach mostly Japanese young people, or what kind of people did you teach?
Actually, it was a mixture, anywhere from 3 to 100, depending on the school that you were based at. You had mostly adult classes, which means basically 13 and up. And depending on the school that you were teaching at, there's also like kids sort of lessons as well. Mm. And I will be very honest and say I was rather fortunate that I didn't have to do many kids lessons because it was so painful. It really was, because you could only speak English to them. they didn't understand what you were saying, and when they were going crazy, you can't discipline them, and you can't speak Japanese to them, so they would just go crazy.
Sounds like a challenging thing to do for sure. I don't think I would want to teach kids either, to be honest. I have nothing against kids. I love my nieces and nephews and everything, but teaching to them is a different kind of experience as adults, and especially if you have a language barrier, I'd imagine that's even more difficult. And so once you arrived in Japan, how had you visited before, or was that your first? So it was your first time ever.
It was the first time, yeah.
And so, how did your expectations measure up to what I was actually there?
Well, as I think I discovered is the norm when you move to a new country, the first 2 or 3 weeks kind of feels like a holiday, right? Because everything's new and you're going, oh, wow, look at that, and that sort of thing.
It's the honeymoon effect.
Exactly. And then sort of reality crept in at about 3 weeks, and because I was 22 at the time, and I was like, holy shit, I've uprooted my life and implanted myself into a new country where the only thing I know how to say in their language is I don't understand. And so that was a little bit overwhelming for a couple of weeks, but then it settled down again, and you start to find your groove in your day-to-day life, and you start your job, and then you start to meet other people, and it gets a little bit more, not bearable, but it gets more and more, normal and a routine.
You're kind of immersing yourself into that local life, right?
Yeah. It was, there was a lot of things that you kind of look at and you go, oh my God, I would never see that happen in my country, or I've never seen that before. So in Japan, it was freaky because like every week you'd see something like that, and just go, oh, wow, that just wouldn't happen back home, or we don't have that, it was really cool.
Absolutely. And of course, Japan is known also for their very small accommodations as well, right? So how was your experience? Where did you live when you were there?
Well, as I mentioned before, the company provides you with an apartment. And when you're applying to get a job with the company, and this company no longer exists, not through my fault, international incident. But what they would do is they would say, we can't guarantee it, but you can list us 3 preferences on the place you'd like to live. And the only thing that I wrote there is, look, I don't care where, as long as I can, live with my mate, because we wanted to go together.
Yeah.
And so we ended up in a 3-bedroom apartment because we were getting a third housemate coming a few weeks after we arrived. Okay. So our apartment was actually quite decent. Having said that, yes, I would go to some of the apartments of my friends, some of whom were students and they couldn't afford much. And yes, the cliches are very true. The little, 15 square meter sort of studio. But the thing about the Japanese is they're very clever with how they arrange things and storage and stuff like that. So they're
we think the Swedish are good at that, right? With IKEA and everything, but Japan is on another level, I think.
Absolutely,
with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And what would you say was the biggest challenge as your first time kind of in a new country? Was it the language barrier, or?
It was it's interesting. I'm not going to say language barrier, but I'm going to say learning the language because, and this happens in a lot of countries, but obviously I don't look Japanese, right? So the thing would be, is you would go, 2 things would happen. You would go up to someone and you'd ask them something in Japanese or something, and they would see, oh, this is they'd instantly just assume you're an English speaker, and then they try and practice their English with you. So that made it hard to get practicing. And then the other thing that happens is, for me at least, Japanese is a very phonetic language. There's no new sounds as an English speaker, and it's very, very, there's no, like crazy sounds like French or difficult sounds. And so from my perspective, it was very easy to say Japanese words and speak Japanese sentences. And you kind of, with the familiar sentences, you could kind of sound quite fluent, even though it's just a rehearsed sentence, but you've got good pronunciation. And then the person would just assume you're fluent in Japanese and go, no, too much. So that was tricky.
Perfected a little, line, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so obviously Japan also is quite known to be very culturally different, right? So the etiquette. How did you manage those cultural differences, and how did you find that?
Honestly, I mean, I don't I'm not pretending I'm some great philosopher or anything, but our theory, my mate and I, our theory was to just be as unobtrusive as possible, because we knew that, excuse me, we knew that Japan was a very different culture to Australian, and they're a lot more reserved, a lot more polite. So we just would make sure that we were not being idiots, basically, and trying to be mindful. Like, for example, on the metro, we never sat down; we always stood. Just so we didn't get like the dirty foreigner looks or anything like that. But as you get more used to it, you find out what is and isn't appropriate, and you learn more about the social structure, and then you can start to ease into the society and be comfortable.
Absolutely. And of course, it's all about just being respectful in the culture you're kind of going to, right?
Yeah.
So that's Japan. You then moved home and then got married and then decided to move to Estonia. And I'd love to hear more about that. Like, how did you even come across it? And tell me tell me the story.
I often say to people when they are, oh, why did you move to Estonia? I start by saying, because of Instagram. And so what happened in our particular situation, we decided, we want to start looking around at countries. And of course, as native English speakers, the native English speaking countries go onto the list automatically. My wife spoke French, so France was on the list as well. And we were looking around for any more options we might have missed. And at the same time, my company was looking for project management software. And I was just, Googling around and looking for software. And of course, because all your devices know exactly what you're doing now, I was just one day randomly scrolling on Instagram and an ad for Scoro came up, which is an Estonian project management software. And I looked at it and I'm like, oh yeah, I'll check it out later. And so I went to the website later on and I'm like, oh, it looks pretty interesting. Where is this company based? And then I looked at the About section and they were based in Estonia. And I'm like, Estonia. And, like a lot of people don't know too much about Estonia, let's be honest. I only knew a few things about it. I think it's the coolest flag in Europe, like the colors. I'm in tech, so I knew that the engineers who created Skype were based in Estonia, and I like classical music, so of course Artuful Park is like the world's most commonly played living composer. So that's basically all I knew about it. But I started looking into it because the company was advertising this in English, not Estonian. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I started looking around and doing a bit more digging on Estonia, and as it turns out, Estonia. Okay, we'll get into all the cliches. Most digital country on earth. We know that. But also they make it very easy, and they encourage foreign talent to come to the country because it's known as one of the Silicon Valleys of Europe. It costs you like 150 euros to get the visa and go over there. Whereas if I wanted to move to the UK, right, I'm Australian. I'm a member of the Commonwealth. The Queen is my head of state. But if I want to move to the UK, the barrier for entry is enormous. You've got to have like £30,000 in your account. You've got to have this, you've got to have that. Whereas Estonia is just like, if you've got the skills, come on over. And so I later, once I looked at all of that, I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then I texted my wife and said, hey, let's move to Estonia. And she replied and said, let's discuss this when I get home. So,
that's
and
amazing.
then one thing led to another, and that's where we ended up. My wife went trampolining against my advice, and she broke her foot.
Oh, no.
So she was stuck at home on the couch feeling very sorry for herself, and so she decided to look for jobs in Estonia because we were going to wait, 6 to 9 months to build up some funds behind us. But then she's just like, no, I want to look for jobs now. She found a job immediately. A week later, she had the interview, and then she was making plans to move over to Estonia. So it happened very quickly once we decided on it.
Amazing. You actually just answered my next question. I was going to say how long between like the planning, the inception of the idea, planning and arrival. But you did it on a quick turnaround, as I understand.
Yeah.
And so obviously the approach was quite clearly a bit different from the first time you moved. So how did you find the second time around moving, especially going so far this time as well, right?
Yeah, so it was different to the other time. So in Japan, everything, well, not everything, but we had an apartment already got for us with all of the main furniture and stuff like that. But because of our circumstances, my wife got the job offer and she was going to move in August. But I had some commitments in Australia that I had to do. So I was going to move over in October. And so she went over and established our new life, and I packed up our old life in that sort of 2.5 months.
So she was
gap.
basically a relocation management company.
Yes, she was. But I mean, to be honest, it was a lot easier because in Estonia, it's way more common for an apartment to be furnished with all the main things that you need when you're renting. So that makes it a lot easier. Whereas, in Australia, that's almost unheard of. So that did make things a bit easier for moving.
So you didn't have to deal with much shipping or anything.
We wouldn't have shipped anything. It wouldn't be worth it. We're more likely to just go and look at the secondhand market, and because it's a huge. We stored a whole bunch of stuff in one of those storage places, and when we eventually move home, we'll get it out of storage again. But I see these people who move like an entire shipping container. It's like, no, I really want my couch. It's like, was it really worth it? Just get a couch locally.
That used to be my customers, so there's a whole industry behind that.
Yes.
But there is, the interesting thing is that the trends are changing. It used to be those big container-sized shipments, but actually you see now in that industry that the shipment sizes are shrinking drastically. People don't have those family heirloom antique furniture that they want to move and stuff like that. Nowadays, it's like IKEA or secondhand, and it's not worth it, as you say. And so you arrived in Estonia. What was your first impressions?
It was late October, so it was a bit cold, and I was, of course, very, very tired from the trip because it's 3 flights to get from Australia to Estonia, so that was about 35 hours. But as I was going in the taxi on Saturday at about midday, of course, it was a complete... it was completely, I've been to lots of countries in Europe, but I've never been to an Eastern European country before. So it was very, very different to look at. I remember how green it was. And of course, unavoidable fact, Estonia is a former Soviet occupied country. So there's a lot of Russian panel houses, which for me was just like, whoa, that's like something you only see on TV, but now it is real. So that was another thing that hit me straight away.
Absolutely, because I suppose, especially coming from Australia, it's a very different scenery, I'd imagine, in terms of the architecture, what it looks like.
Oh, yeah, completely different.
And what year did you arrive in Estonia?
That was 2018.
Okay, so it was quite late in the journey of the country in terms of the rapid development that was happening in the 2000s, right?
Yeah.
And what part of Thailand did you live?
We ended up in, Christina. That's where we ended up.
So quite central then.
Quite central and still easily accessible to the centre. So it was a pretty nice spot to be located, I think.
And how long did you stay in Estonia for?
Well, our plan was always flexible. We had the notion of, okay, let's go for 2 years, and if it's really awesome, we'll stay longer. If we really hate it or something, then we'll cut it short. But we were pretty elastic in that sort of space. And then, of course, 2020 happened. So the thing that everybody loves so much is that COVID happened. So we thought, okay, we're both in stable jobs here, and back home things weren't so great. And then eventually you couldn't even, as an Australian citizen, I couldn't even get into my own country, which is another story. But we just decided, let's go with the less risky option and just stay the course now and keep going. And so we ended up staying there a bit longer. Then my wife wasn't having a great time in her company, and she got approached on LinkedIn by a headhunter saying, "Oh, you want to come and take this position at this company in Switzerland?" And that didn't work out. But then the idea of living in Switzerland or kind of got her, because her thing is the romance countries, France, Spain, all that sort of thing. I'm the Germanophile, so I like the Germanic countries, and we were in technically a Germanic country, so we were like, okay, well, let's look at moving to Switzerland then. So I got on LinkedIn. I found her a job immediately, and she got that immediately.
Before we go to Switzerland completely, there's just one more thing I wanted to talk to you about, your life in Estonia. So,
sure.
As we all know, and I've been in the expats group in Estonia for quite some time, and also the many research that I've started for this podcast shows that the hardest thing people say is to find new friends and make new friends, because Estonians are not exactly known to be the warm, fuzzy, approachable type. However, you started a stand-up comedy career while you were here. So do you want to tell me a little bit more about that? And what was your audience like and that journey?
Career is probably a generous word, but I mean...
That's okay.
So I think it was the realization that I'd, again, uprooted my life and gone to a completely foreign country. Like, it was similar in Japan. So we moved to Japan, we were there and we were comfortable. And it's like, what else could I be doing? And so, like, in Japan, as a native English speaker, I did voiceover work because they really want native English for certain things. And so you do that there. And my professional history has always involved presenting and training adults. And so if I've got to talk to a group of adults for an entire day and train them on something, you don't want to talk at them, you want to talk with them, right?
Absolutely.
And you sort of build up a bank of little jokes you can make here and there just to keep things lighthearted rather than like this dull, monotone lecture. And so I figured when I was in Estonia, because I'd always thought maybe I'll try stand-up one day because basically it's the same as what I've been doing, except you just have to be funny. No pressure because, of course, that's not easy. But it just came with being in a new country again. I wanted to push myself and give it a go.
Push those boundaries, basically.
Exactly. So I thought, what better place to start a stand-up career in English, where it's the audience's third or fourth language. So it was rolling the dice, but it did pay off, and I did enjoy my time up on stage, and it was very cool. We were always quite surprised that stand-up is such a big, well, not big thing, but it's such a common thing in Estonia because of like you say, Estonians are fairly reserved, but there was lots of big-time international stand-up acts that stopped in Tallinn, so it was pretty cool, and to be up on the stage as well, that was fun.
The secret thing about Estonians is that we actually quite like humor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's I'm in Estonia, we have the Go3, which is like the local streaming platform similar to Netflix, and it has lots of great local movies and series which all have a fantastic comedy aspect to them. But they don't add English subtitles, which drives me crazy. And it's like you have this huge population actually now of expats living in Estonia. So I think I need to start championing with them because, adding subtitles is not that difficult. Add English as an option. And I think a lot of those movies open up to also what the actual Estonian kind of culture is, I guess, because a lot of those are, pop culture in every country, really. In Korea, it's the K-pop and so forth. So I think, I need to start championing with them on that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Switzerland. So you moved to Switzerland how long ago?
We moved in August of last year.
Awesome. So you've been there for almost a year now.
Almost a year. And we moved, and of course it was very different than when we moved to Estonia. And it's kind of like the polar opposites in some ways, because with Estonia, the whole digital society cliche, it's very true. It's just a matter of getting into that, getting access to the site. Once you're in, everything's great. I do my taxes in 20 seconds on my phone. I vote or whatever on my phone. I sell a car on my phone and do the transfer and all that sort of stuff. So it's extremely impressive how far that the bureaucracy has been advanced to be digital, which is really, really cool. Then we moved to Switzerland, and it was like it's like we moved 200 years back in time, because Switzerland is exact opposite of everything that Estonia does. And, it's, you want to get health insurance. You have to go to a physical office and talk to someone, and they want to talk to you for an hour. And it's like, no, I just need the policy. Sell me the policy. Everything has to be on paper. I swear there has to be some archaic sort of law here that says there must be a paper trail for everything you do, because I'll give you an example. So if I'm in Tallinn, I can get the Bolt app and find a car and just get in and drive. And then once I finish my trip, it just charges my card. Yeah, nice and simple, the way you'd expect it in the world.
I've got one parked outside right now.
I'm coming back to Estonia in a couple of weeks, and I can't wait to get back on the scooters, because they don't do scooters here because it's too mountainous and they wouldn't go up the hills. But if you want the equivalent of Bolt here, if I go and get a car, first of all, they don't have an app. You have to fill in a form, and they post you a physical card to use when you get into the car.
Wow.
You scan the card on the car, which unlocks the door and allows you to start the car. You do your driving. It's got this kind of like in taxis, they've got that little screen.
Meter?
They've got like a meter that tells you how far you've gone. And then you park the car, you lock it with the card, and they don't charge your account. What they do is they send you a paper invoice at the end of the month with all of your trips on it, and you need to pay that. So it's it's so crazy. And it's just, it's frustrating. And I know we've been spoiled having been in Estonia with access to all of that stuff. I still access the Estonian digital ecosystem now, like the health portal and stuff like that. I still have access to it. But here it's literally the opposite. And even things like, okay, so we're in Lausanne. It's a walkable city. It's about population of about 110,000 or so. So it's a bit smaller than Tallinn, but it's very compact, like very, very close together.
Yeah.
And we were going to be living in Lausanne, so we had to register ourselves as moved to Lausanne. And when we were looking for an apartment, you couldn't go too far, like this way or that way, because then you would be in a completely different location. You have to register, even though it's all the one area, the one contiguous area. Like, it's just absolutely insane, the amount of red tape and bureaucracy that they have here. I swear a third of the population must be involved in city bureaucracy, because
administration.
Exactly. And it's so it's terrible compared to Estonia.
It's interesting because I've always known Switzerland is more bureaucratic. And obviously from my household goods moving days when I was helping people move their personal effects, I knew that because there's only 2 countries in Europe that I know that require an actual paper customs form with the original signature to be sent with the goods to the customs. And that is Switzerland and, interestingly, Sweden. Sweden still requires a paper form too. But Switzerland, it's a very interesting and definitely very different from Estonia. So,
completely. The trope of or the cliche of Swiss efficiency. I'm sorry, it only applies to public transport, like trains and trams
and watches. Don't forget the watches.
And watches. Yeah, but other than that, the trains and trams are absolutely sublime. You can get a train to anywhere in the mountains. In fact, sometimes it's the only way. So the train and public transport system, I cannot fault it. But everything else is just a headache. So it's very frustrating at times. But it's like you're in this bipolar relationship, because you've got all that horrible overhead. It's very Catholic, so of course, supermarkets close at 7 p.m. and they're not open on a Sunday, and that's so annoying after coming from Estonia, where everything's just convenient and open, like back home in Australia. But then I look out at the view across Lake Geneva to the Alps, and I'm just like, oh my God, this country is so beautiful.
I was just about to ask you, do you ski? Or snowboard?
No. As an Australian, it's extremely difficult to get into winter sports, because even though it's a continent, there's only one tiny little bit down in the corner there where it actually snows, and that means, of course, that it's extremely expensive. So I have never done any winter sports. The first time I ever saw snow was when I moved to Japan, and I was like, oh my God, I was like a child playing in the snow and all that sort of stuff. And then moving to Estonia, which is, of course, a winter country, so it was amazing to see the snow there and to go to the Christmas market with the snow. The most I've ever tried is, of course, in Estonia, it's pretty flat. So the cross skiing,
I always joke that Estonia is flat as a pancake, and it really, really is. It's just
It
like
is.
so flat.
Yeah, and that's another extreme looking at the Alps surrounding me here. But unfortunately, so my company, we went out for the boss's birthday and we went to do cross-country skiing. And of course, I was the only person who's never done it before. And we went to, I forgot which one. It's the only one that's near Tallinn anyway, but that's not important. So point was, I turn up, I've got the really terrible old wooden hire skis, and they clip me in and they put me in the track and they go, okay, off you go, and I'm like, what do I do? So and you push, indeed. I found out, and so I was trying to stay as basic as possible. Now the problem with this was, we were doing it towards the end of winter, and it was at that time of year where the temperature keeps going -1, +1, -1, +1. So it was really icy and slippery instead of just being nice powdery snow. And so I ended up falling over a number of times, and then it wasn't until the next day I realized all the muscles that I had exercised that I just never done because I'd never done skiing before. So no, I am not a winter sports person, not saying I'd never try. But that was my foray into the world of winter sports so far.
It's definitely a full body exercise, that's for sure. And you don't even realize so much as while you're doing it. It's the next day when it hits you, and you're like,
exactly what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm from Estonia. As we said, it's really flat, but I lived 2 years in Canada, and I absolutely fell in love with the mountains. And I remember first time I visited Vancouver. This was some years ago now. I was there on a short-term work assignment. And I remember going towards Whistler, and we went from Whistler further up north, which is like places where you don't have cell service for like an hour while you're driving up the mountains. But we stopped on the side of the mountain highway because there was this huge mountain and like a really blue lake, beautiful scenery. And that's the first time, I have to say, I truly realized how small and insignificant, not in a negative way, but how small and insignificant we really are in this world as individuals. Sure. You know, you look at the size of nature, basically. When you come from such a flat place, it's an eye opener.
Oh, definitely. And Australia is the flattest continent. So even though we do have some mountains, we don't have the sort of mountains that you've got here in Switzerland or Canada. And in Japan, the first time I ever experienced snow-capped mountains, I went to a town or city rather, on the west coast called Kanazawa. It's famous as a hot spring town. And I took the train, and I looked out the window at one point, and it was just this ring of mountains, snow-capped mountains. And I had the exact same moment that you did. I was just in awe of how tiny we are. So yeah, it's I like how Estonia is proud that their highest peak is 6 meters higher than Latvia's.
And we call it the Big Egg Mountain.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's humble, okay? So you've done now 3 moves so far in your lifetime. What would you say was the most challenging of the 3 so far?
That's a very good question. I'll rule out Switzerland because my wife speaks French and she took care of all of that administrative stuff. And she'll tell me, no, I don't speak French. She has like passable French and she can make herself understood. But believe me, if it was me, we would have had no hope. So I won't say Switzerland because I didn't have to deal a lot of it. And I won't say it's really difficult between Japan and Estonia because my wife set us up in Estonia. And when we got to Japan, we had, here's your apartment, here's your stuff. So,
but it's not just about the process, though. It's also about the experience, right? When you were moving, and how did you find settling in and the experience overall?
Yeah, I think that Japan was more challenging than Estonia. Estonians are too smart for their own good, and as you well know, if you're in Tallinn, Tartu, or Pärnu, then if you go to a shop and try to speak Estonian, they know you're not Estonian, and as soon as you say tere and you don't say it properly, they're like, oh, clearly we're going to switch to English now. But in Japan, the level of English is much lower. So that made it more difficult than Estonia. Having said that, there were other benefits, like with public transport in Japan, the train network, everything was in English as well. So that actually made it pretty easy to get around. But I actually found that as a culture and a society, Estonians and Japanese are actually very, very similar. You've got quite polite, reserved people on both countries. It can take a while to make friends, but once you sort of earn that trust, you have a friend for life. Like Estonians don't take friends lightly. And if they're willing to let you into that space, then you're in a very special space. And it's actually quite similar with Japan. I still have friends from Japan that are very dear to me. And in fact, my wife had never been to Japan. So for our honeymoon in 2016, we went to Japan and, we visited a number of cities. And I lived in Nagoya, which is the third largest city in Japan. And I wanted to go back there to show us some cool places, but also where we used to live, just like and there was this little tiny bar, no bigger than the room that I'm sitting in now. And, we got to know the owner quite well. And it was 10 years since I had lived in Japan. And I said, we've got to take a chance and go back to this bar. And I went back up the stairs because there was this tiny little, and opened the door. And there he was standing there. And I said, "Hisashiburi ni," and that confused him because in Japanese that means, it's been a long time, it's good to see you or whatever. And he was confused because he didn't recognize me. And we took our seats and I had to explain. It's like, oh, it's Andrew, remember from, 10 years ago? And eventually he was like, oh, I was like, he was so excited. And
the light bulb moment hit.
Exactly. And what he did when I was living there originally, because it was this beautiful, dimly lit bar and he always had like nice music playing in the background, I actually gave him a CD that I'm like, hey, this will probably suit. And so he's like, oh, cool, thanks. And then when I went back there 10 years later, as soon as he recognized me, he went and changed the music and put that CD back
That's
on.
amazing.
It was just one of those awesome moments,
It's like one of my favorite parts of living abroad is the connections you make with the people where you live. Because when you're traveling and like even I did the whole digital nomad where I was spending time here, there and everywhere. You do meet people and you make some connections, but when you're actually living in a country, it's a totally different experience.
Exactly. And that was why, I hadn't left Australia before, and I thought, no. And it was that age. I was 22. People were doing like Kontiki tours across Europe, or they were going up and backpacking and that sort of stuff. I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to actually learn about the place. So actually living in the place was way more appealing to me. And in fact, when I moved to Estonia and my wife already had a job, and remember I said the first 2 or 3 weeks always feels like a holiday, yeah? So I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't looking for a job or anything, but eventually my wife would come home from work and say, so what did you do today? And that list of things would just get smaller and smaller. So she's like, look for a job. So I'm like, okay,
it's time.
I look for a job. Yeah. And so the job that I ended up getting, during the interview, my boss said to me, he's like, okay, so you're Australian, you've moved to Estonia. I mean, do you see this as like a professional move for you, or is it a cultural move? And I said, well, I don't see why it can't be both, because it's not like working in Estonia isn't valid professionally. So I can, push my career forward professionally, but I can also, because I'm living here, really get to learn about the country and the culture and the history, which I must say, like, is completely fascinating. And one thing I am certain of is that I will be back in 2024 for the singing festival, because that in 2019 absolutely blew me away. 119,000 people, 10% of the population in the one place singing and dancing. And my bosses, I got two bosses. My boss's husband is French. Of course, they live in Estonia. And he's like, I don't understand you Estonians, the entire rest of the year, you're cold, you don't talk to each other, you don't smile. But then for these 3 or 4 days, everyone's singing and smiling and hugging and all sorts of stuff. But it's definitely the reason why you want to live in another country is to find out about that culture and that history and get a perspective. Perspectives are so important, because you can be at home in your country and not realize why things could be better or worse if you're in a different country. So if I move to a different country, I can say, oh my God, they do that here. That makes so much sense. Why don't we do that? Or it makes you go, oh my God, I'm so lucky to live in this country because we don't do what happens here. And the more countries you go to, I mean, it's not practical to live in, dozens and dozens of countries for most people, but even just going and living in one country, and that's quite different from your own, is such a valuable life experience. And it's a matter of just putting yourself out there, and for some people, going beyond your comfort zone in order to have that experience, because it's so important in life, I think.
Absolutely. And I find also once people do move and live somewhere else, a lot of them become what I call serial expat. And I called myself that too, because, I lived in Ireland and then I went to visit my friend in London and I was like, oh my God, this place is amazing. I want to live here. So I moved there, and then I moved to Canada, and now I'm in Estonia, and I probably will end up moving somewhere again eventually at some point, right? So what does the future hold for you? Are you planning to move again at some point? And if so, where and why?
So we're pretty certain, unless things change, because that's how we've always looked at these things. We have our general idea of what's going to happen, but we're flexible. Our next move will be home to Australia. We know that. But we are not closing the door on living elsewhere because we're both quite similar like that. And so, we're not young anymore. We're not old, but we're not backpacking age, if you know what I mean. So any place that we move to in the future, it would really depend on the opportunity. There's a chance that Japan is on the list simply because, I love it. My wife loved it. We know that it's a fantastic place. In fact, I'll give you a little anecdote about Japan. So before I left Australia for Estonia, I worked for a software company that provided risk management software primarily for hospitals and health.
Okay.
And so I was out at this little country hospital. I had to drive like 3.5 hours from Melbourne to get there. And we were having a coffee break. And I was sitting there talking with these women, and one of them mentioned that, she was really worried because her daughter, who was 14, was going to Japan for a school thing for 3 months. And her daughter had never left the country before, and not to put any negative stereotypes on country people, but they're not as big a travelers. So she was a bit worried about the concept of her young daughter being in Japan. And I said, oh my God, you don't know how lucky you are. Like, if I ever had kids and they start going, oh, I want to go overseas, I will tell them, go to Japan, and I will be able to sleep at night, because honestly, it's one of the safest places in the world. It's just, and Estonia wasn't dissimilar, right? I feel Estonia is one of the safest places in the world as well. But with Japan, it's the cliche of honor in Japan is not a cliche; it's a real thing, and it's just. Yeah, I just explained to her everything I could, and she felt a lot better after that. So
more reassured.
Exactly, yeah. But so Japan's on the list. We can't again rule out any of the romance countries because that's what my wife really likes, and I to be honest, I love them too. Canada might be on the list because we quite like the idea of sane America. No, not to.
If you do, I just have one recommendation for you. Don't go to Toronto.
Okay, why?
Because I think Toronto is very similar to like New York and London vibes, whereas if you go somewhere like Vancouver, it's more like artistic people and like.
Okay.
At least from my observation on spending time both sides. I'm a fan of the West Coast on both US and Canada. But if I had to choose, I would choose sane America too.
And that's not to cast a blanket stereotype on all Americans. I've been to America. America's full of amazing, helpful, polite people. But they don't do themselves many favors when they're overseas, do they?
No, but I've spent considerable time now in the US, and I have lots of friends from my gaming communities, all pretty much based in the US. So I have a lot of amazing people I've met through there, and also business wise. But yeah, it's the hyper capitalism kind of that doesn't really quite go
the extremes,
with me, so. Yeah, exactly, and I think US has a lot of extremes, in many ways. So that's why I would prefer Canada. I feel like it's more balanced.
Yeah. And then the other unknown quantity for us is Latin America, because we've never been there. And that's something that we would probably look into as well, just because it's quite different than anywhere else. I'm a fan of remote places. With my job when I was in Australia, I would go to some extreme, because Australia is an empty continent, right? So if you have to go to the centre, that's quite remote, and I really enjoyed those. I was also considering at one time to get a job with the Australian Antarctic Division and live in Antarctica for 12 months. I thought that would be amazing as well, but it never came to be. And then I suppose then that's probably the main places that we'd look at. But we're not sure when that would happen. It's more one of those feelings, like
the ideas at the back of your head, that kind
of and then it starts to come more to the front of your mind, and it's like, I think it's time again. So we'll just let it play out naturally.
Absolutely, and it often also depends on what kind of opportunity comes along, right? Sometimes something might come along, and you're like, "Oh my God, this is amazing! I'd love to do it. Let's go."
Yeah, exactly.
So before we wrap up on our kind of discussion today, what would you say would be your biggest advice to someone who is considering their first move abroad, other than get on and go with it? What would be your biggest advice you'd give someone?
I would say think about why you want to go. Just like when I had the job interview with my boss, because I still work for my Estonian company now, just remotely. When he said, is this a cultural thing or is it a professional thing? So first of all, think why you're doing it. The second thing I would suggest, of course, is research. The internet is obviously a vast treasure trove of information, and you'll find information from every expat community in the world. There are obviously things that you won't know until you get there, but try to find out as much as you can in advance, and it will make the process a lot smoother. You just need to be prepared,
Absolutely.
Be reasonable.
And I also think it helps set the expectations as well when you arrive, right? So you're not scrambling and being like, "Oh my God, what's this?"
Actually, that's probably one of the key pieces of advice is never be attached to expectations, because you can expect one thing and it's completely different once you're physically there. So for me, I suppose we all have our idea of Japanese food, and so sushi, ramen, that sort of stuff. Exactly. But then you go to Japan, and this is no different to virtually any other country that has food culture around the world. But the food is just staggering variety and stuff that you've never heard of, and so like that's a really soft thing. That's like food. Oh, great! Like that's okay. But if you move to a particular country and you find, okay, Estonians aren't, the most warm and welcoming people in the beginning, but they're generally not hostile. Whereas some countries you might go and move to, and you find that generally people are pretty hostile towards you as a foreigner. So don't be attached to expectations, because very often you will not get what you expected. So you've got to you have to have a degree of flexibility. And one thing that's always amusing on the expats in Estonia group, of course, as you lurk in there, is the number of people who go to Estonia, a northeastern European country of 1.3 million people, and say, "Oh, why can't I get this ultra-specific food product from my country in Estonia? It's ridiculous." It's like, be prepared to try something different. If I'm desperate for Vegemite, I'll bring it with me from Australia. But don't expect that the country that you're living in is going to have everything you are used to from your country. And that's part of the whole reason of living somewhere else. Yes, you can have your comfort food from home, but don't be wedded to it. Try new stuff. Find a new local comfort food. It's the whole, not to dabble in food for too much, but food is amazing everywhere you go around the world. So just jump in and go home if you want to have your particular food fries.
I mean, absolutely. And I think with everything and everywhere you go, you have to be open-minded, and you have to understand that the local country is not catering to your specific needs. They're catering for their citizens as a general, as opposed to visitors or expats. And some countries cater better than others to expats. Mm-hmm. And I feel that Estonia is doing a reasonably good job. I'm sure there's plenty of ways they could improve. But they're trying to be open, and they're trying to be supportive as well, I guess.
I think Estonia does a really good job with that. The Settle in Estonia program, the information sessions, International House, the complimentary A1 course. Like, I think that they're doing a really good job. I don't have as much exposure to other countries, but here in Switzerland, here's Swiss bureaucracy for you. Moved here last August, and just this week I received an official letter from the city saying, hey, come to this information session for new arrivals 9 months later. So that's classic Swiss bureaucracy for you. So Estonia does do a good job. They are very accessible. And people should take advantage of those sorts of things, because if a country is willing to be welcoming and to do those sorts of things, you'll find that that's very different from a lot of other countries. So I think if you're moving to a country and they offer that sort of thing, then you're probably on the right track with that country.
Absolutely. And I think also it goes back to that research as well. So, if you are moving to Estonia, those services are available, and they're free as well, which is amazing, because there's a whole industry that provides that service as a paid service, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the fact that you have that free resource, government provided, designed for expats, and you also, I'm assuming, when you go to these sessions, you get to meet other expats as well.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It goes along with the whole making new friends as well, right?
Exactly.
So really is about putting yourself out there.
Yeah, and just to contrast how Estonia does it versus, so I'm in Lausanne in French-speaking Switzerland, and so a condition of my visa here is I have to achieve A1 proficiency in French within 1 year, otherwise I'll be kicked out. So that's very different to Estonia, where they don't require you to learn the language, but they give you a free A1 course. So just, again, contrasts between different countries and how they do it.
It's encouragement instead of requirement.
Yes, and it's necessity makes it gives you a bit more, like you say, encouragement to actually learn that language.
So, how are your French lessons going?
A1.
A1. Awesome.
Yeah.
How's your Estonian, though?
I have barely retained any Estonian, simply because, there was only one time in Estonia. So we went to Otepää for a summer holiday for jaanipäev, and we had a hire car, and we were driving around the area down there, like the Livonian areas. We went to one of these old manor houses or castles, and we went into the restaurant there, and the only time that I ever had someone who didn't speak English, that was the only time when we were trying to order our lunch. Everywhere else we went, Estonians were just like, oh, okay, well, it looks like we're switching to English.
Absolutely. It's good for other expats as well to hear that, coming here, if you don't find Estonian easy to learn, because I hear it's very difficult.
That was one of the things before we moved there, that for native English speakers, at least, it's one of the most difficult languages to learn. And that's obviously true.
It's been named as the most difficult Latin alphabet-based language to learn.
Wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, obviously, in any country, you learn all the pleasantries. You learn how to
hello and
exactly. You learn how to swear. But I'm not going to be sitting down with Carlos tomorrow having a morning tea and sparkling conversation in Estonian. And I think it's Estonia wasn't going to be my forever home. And so honestly, we just got a little bit lazy, because most of the time we're in Tallinn or like I said, only one occasion where we were really stuck without having an extensive knowledge of Estonian.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you enjoyed your time here, so I'm glad to hear that. Obviously,
Absolutely
I'm biased.
loved my time. Oh no, you can be biased because I think Estonia is an amazing country, and especially when I learned about the history of the people and the mindset of the people and the culture of the people, and I 100% have lifelong Estonian friends now, and it's a place that I will return. It's like Japan for me. Like I will go back there
Amazing.
because. Yeah.
Maybe next time you're here, we can meet for a coffee and meet face to face as well.
Like I said, a couple of weeks I'll be back in Tallinn because I go back every so often for work, and so yeah.
Amazing. Well, we'll need to set something up for that. Before we wrap it up, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
No, I don't think so. I'm not very good. I'm better when I'm prompted.
No, you have been an absolutely fantastic guest. I really appreciate you coming along and sharing your different journeys and stories, and I'll be keeping my eye out and seeing where you might move next. But repatriation is a whole nother topic that I think I will address at the podcast at one point, because it actually is quite different, especially experiencing it myself now with 16 years, half my life being away. It's very, very different. But you also mentioned that you might want to explore South America. I actually have a guest coming up who lived in Brazil. So look out for that episode so you can learn about her experience there and what it's like.
Yeah, for sure.
But of course, South America there's also so many different options. So it's somewhere where I haven't visited, but would also love to.
Yeah, for sure. It's a very, very unique place.
But with that, I'll wrap up the recording. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Expat Life with Maimendel. Next week, I will be joined by Erik Munoz. He is a Mexican engineer who moved from Mexico to Estonia in 2014. Erik is passionate about business, music, and self-development. He also loves to talk about polemic topics from different perspectives and learn from others' experiences. He's an out-of-the-box thinker, even when it can bring some bad faces around him at times, but that is the spicy touch he likes to have in life. Promoting his home country around the globe is something very important for Erik, same as defending equality and justice for those who need it. He sounds like my kind of person. Make sure to subscribe and tune in next week to learn more about Erik and his journey so far. Thank you again for listening, and have a great rest of your day, wherever in the world you are.